Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out tonight to spend the next hour and 15 minutes with Riverkeeper and our partners to discuss the Army Corps proposal for storm surge barriers in New York and New Jersey Harbor, a call for a comprehensive approach to resilience. My name's Rebecca Martin. I'm the director of the Community Partnership Program. Tonight, I'm going to be facilitating and moving things along. And I'm here this evening with my colleague, Chrissy Remein, and she is the Hudson River Watershed Project Manager. This presentation tonight is being recorded, although we'll stop recording during the Q&A, the question and answer session. That'll occur at the end of the webinar. So if you could keep your questions, write them down. There'll be a chance for you to enter them into the Q&A box, which we'll describe at the end. And that will occur at the end of the evening. Next slide. So Riverkeeper's mission: Riverkeeper protects and restores the Hudson River from source to sea and safeguards drinking water supplies through advocacy rooted in community partnerships, science, and the law. And tonight we welcome anyone who isn't a member at Riverkeeper to support this important work and become a member. And you can contact Monica Dietrich. Her email address is here to learn how, and this information and more materials from tonight, including a video of the presentation, will be sent to all participants and made available at riverkeeper.org/barriers. So more on that a little bit later. Next slide. All right, so we thought we'd have a little bit of fun here in a minute. So we'll walk through the agenda, and we have a trivia question. But tonight we're going to be offering presentations from Riverkeeper, from the New York City and New Jersey Urban Tributaries Work Group, and Miami Waterkeeper is with us tonight, followed by our action to help participants, members, able to get their comments in by the March 7th deadline, which we'll discuss later, followed by our question and answer period. Next slide. All right, so our trivia question tonight, as our topic is storm surge barriers in New York, New Jersey, in the New York, New Jersey Harbor. How many miles of shoreline are there in New York City? So we don't have a chat function tonight, but maybe we could have a raise of hands. Is it A, 320 miles? 2. All right, is it B, 420 miles? Okay, 2. We have a tie. Is it C, 520 miles? Yes. Wow, experts. Bingo. Whoops. Is it D, 1,250 miles? All right, we have a winner. Next slide. You were right. Most of you were right. There's 520 miles that New York City is an archipelago boasting 520 miles of waterfront, and that's longer than Miami, Boston, Los Angeles, and San Francisco combined. Truly a city on the water. Thanks for that. That was fun. All right, we're going to begin our presentations. So it's my pleasure to introduce Tracy Brown, who is our president and Hudson Riverkeeper. Tracy became president and Hudson Riverkeeper in 2021. She previously served as regional director of water protection at Save the Sound, establishing their New York office, which delivers science-based projects that protect Long Island Sound and increase community resilience. Prior to joining Save the Sound, Brown worked at Riverkeeper for 7 years and was instrumental in developing Riverkeeper's water quality monitoring programs. So with that, I'll turn it over to Tracy. Thanks so much for coming out. Enjoy the presentations.
Thanks, Rebecca. All right, so I'm going to get us started with an overview of the study and Riverkeeper's position on the study. Next slide. I'm going to talk about what is the Army Corps of Engineers New York, New Jersey Harbor and Tributary Study, which we call HATS, Harbor and Tributary Study, where we are currently in the process with that study. I'm going to share what the 5 alternatives were that have been presented, and then the one currently tentatively selected plan that we are all commenting on right now in public comment period. And then I'm going to talk about ways that we can call for bringing about a better plan to meet our needs. Next slide. So HATS is considered a mega study in Army Corps of Engineers parlance. It was started after Hurricane Sandy, when Congress mandated the Corps to address storm surges in 9 eastern coastal regions. So we are just one of 9 regions that were inundated during Superstorm Sandy, and that is what triggered this study process. You can see on the right the map of the area for our study region, the New York, New Jersey Harbor and Tributary Study. This is the area that the Corps has assessed. In addition to the Corps, who are the federal partners, we also very importantly have local non-federal co-sponsors and partners. So our co-sponsors are the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation and the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. Our local non-federal partners are New York State Department of State and the New York City Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice. So the co-sponsors have more authority and kind of a dominant role in interacting with the Corps, and then the partners are at the table as well, but in a secondary role. So the whole project started with a cost share agreement. In addition to the mandate, then it was a cost share, and that split for the construction of the project was agreed that it would be 65% federal funding and 35% local funding. Right now, the tentatively selected plan that we're looking at is estimated to cost around $52 billion. The operations and maintenance of that infrastructure, once it is built, is likely, based on what we see in other communities, to be 100% the cost of the local sponsors and or partners. So we're looking at New York State, New Jersey, and New York City picking up that full operation and maintenance cost. Next slide. So what's at stake here? So obviously there's a lot at stake. We have our coastal communities and our ecosystems that are threatened by sea level rise, which we now understand also includes rising groundwater. So you don't have to be on the coast to experience that. Stationary storm systems, meaning these heavy rain systems like Hurricane Ida brought. The storm surges, which is the water coming from the sea, which is what Sandy brought, and that is the narrow focus of this study. And then the compound flooding of these things all happening in different combinations, creating, a lot of variety in how floodwater can be showing up in our communities. We also have environmental justice and low-income communities on the front line experiencing these impacts. By the Corps' calculation, about 60% of the residents within the impacted region from storm surge in this study are low-income communities. We also have a lot of important ecosystems that are at risk, as Rebecca pointed out. We live in an archipelago here around New York City, and where multiple estuaries meet, a lot of river systems, and a lot of wildlife and other important life in our region. And then we also have critical local and nationally significant infrastructure within the study plan. Next slide. So where are we at today in the process? So the Army Corps, as I mentioned, this process was triggered by Hurricane Sandy and a congressional mandate. That is they're the boss of the Corps, so they tell the Corps what to do. That's consistent. Then in 2016, that cost sharing agreement was signed and the alternative analysis work began. So the Corps then had their project and started to look at what were the scenarios to address storm surge for our region. In 2018, they released their work to date, which included 5 alternative approaches to address storm surges. And then they got public comments. We commented on Riverkeeper. I'm sure a lot of people on the phone also commented at that point. Then there was an interim report that had some updates responding to those comments, another opportunity to comment. And then the next year, the project was actually defunded by the Trump administration. And so it just paused. Then last year, the Biden administration restored the funding and the study resumed, and the Corps really picked up from where they had stopped in 2019 and just kind of took that work and moved it forward to where we are now, which is towards the end of last year in the fall, they released their tentatively selected plan and draft feasibility report. And now we have the public comment period on March 7th. At the same time, actually, one other thing on that slide, thanks, Monica. During this process, after we saw the alternatives and the interim and realized what was coming and realized that the Corps was going on this very narrow mandate to look at storm surge, and it really was just a square peg for a round or lumpy flower-shaped hole. I mean, there's so much complexity in what we have to address in the region here related to our flooding. We started to do lobbying work. So starting in 2020 and ongoing, we first lobbied for changes to what we call WARDA. That is an acronym for the legislation that tells the Corps what they should work on. We were successful in getting changes to WARDA and also passing legislation to go back to Congress, the boss of the Corps, and say, hey, we don't just want something that looks at storm surges. We need to also look at sea level rise, heavy rain events, and compound flooding. This is a much more complicated problem. Please expand your lens of focus. So that work happened. Next slide. So I included at the top of this slide, this is kind of the Corps' visualization I took from one of their presentations that shows the phases of the process. So by their process, we're in the planning phase, not all the way done, still in it. I approximated their % of progress with the STAR. After this comes pre-construction, engineering and design, then construction, which will include design refinements, and operation and maintenance, which is estimated the operational life of the infrastructure in this plan is around 50 years. So at this point, we have our comment period. We're continuing to lobby. Our next steps are that the Corps has a decision milestone where they need to finalize on the tentatively selected plan in April. Then they develop and submit a final integrated feasibility report January of the following year. So that will have more details around what's in the tentatively selected plan, which is still, conceptual by their own description. So really not very detailed in terms of what we'll see on the ground. And then by June of next year, the chief's report goes to Congress. And when the chief's report is submitted and Congress approves it, that ends the study period. So at that point, our planning is done. And then in order to move forward into the next phase of pre-construction, engineering and design, Congress has to approve the plan, and then they have to appropriate funds to take it into the next stage. And there is no estimate in the documents that I found on how long that period of pre-construction, design, and engineering could take. But the plan does say that in general, the construction schedule is estimated to span from 2030 to 2044. So I think we can assume, there's 5 or 6 years in the pre-construction, engineering and design and funding process. By their guesstimates, and then we're looking at a 14-year construction schedule. Now, at the same time, even though we have our comment period ending right now, there will be many more comment periods within this long process. You can see by the visual that we are very much at the beginning of a marathon, not a sprint. And we need to continue to do lobbying for our local leadership. We need to continue to be talking about expanding the focus and updating the cost benefit analysis, because even though we succeeded in getting changes to legislation, those changes have not been reflected in the plan. As I said, the plan picked up from 2018 and moved forward, not reflecting what came through WARDA or other legislation or executive orders. So more on that later. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to show you next the 5 alternatives. I'm going to use the slides that the Army Corps is showing. But before I show you them, I just want to be really clear about what we're seeing, what these designs and the analysis is based on. So the 5 alternatives and the selection of the tentative plan are based on outdated Army Corps of Engineers cost benefit analysis. So we have heard that, and it's mandated by the federal government, that all the big agencies, including the Corps, needs to be updating their cost benefit analysis right now. And it appears that our study is grandfathered in under the old cost benefit analysis, which really just looks at the value of real estate and physical damages, and specifically damages that impact the national GDP. The new cost benefit analysis is under development, but there's no indication that we're going to benefit from this expanded and more nuanced cost benefit analysis. We're really looking at this old approach to property values. Also, the way that this analysis was conducted doesn't reflect other things that came in the WARDA revisions that we were able to lobby for successfully in 2020 and 2022. And those include new mandates that there needs to be a more comprehensive approach to looking at types of flooding, and that nature and nature-based infrastructure needs to be prioritized. And finally, it also does not adequately reflect Biden administration initiatives, of which there have been many, including executive orders and other requirements, first and foremost being a comprehensive analysis of benefits that now going forward, cost benefit analysis needs to include environmental and social impacts, among other things, and every federal government should be changing their cost benefit analysis accordingly. There also has been a Biden administration roadmap for natural and nature-based infrastructure, saying that that must be given priority consideration in federal infrastructure investments. And then there's a universe of environmental justice related executive orders. People might have heard of one of the better known ones, Justice 40, the Justice 40 initiative, which says that 40% of benefits from big federal investments like this one should go to disadvantaged communities, should address legacy pollution, and meet other metrics to address environmental injustice, historic injustice, and lack of investment in communities. Okay, so with those caveats, here are the 5 alternatives. The first one is the no action alternative. So this is their slide, which is future without the project condition. You can see on the right that the map that they include here is the 1% flood impact. This is also referred to sometimes as the 100-year storm, although that's becoming more of a misnomer as our climate changes and these storms happen more frequently. So it's called the 1% flood extent. The blue shows the areas within our region that will be inundated based on those models. The feasibility study has a lot of detail on what will happen with no action, and I encourage people to read it. It's really enlightening and interesting. So, you know, they're saying in this slide that the assumption is that the no action plan is just no federal action through the Army Corps, but it assumes the other actions and plans that are happening will happen. And it also talks about their sea level rise projection. The sea level rise projection that all these assessments are based on is intermediate. So they have 3 different projections, low, conservative 1, intermediate, and higher. And they're really exponentially different going out into the future. So this is one area where we believe that the Army Corps is being too conservative, and we believe that the sea level rise will be greater, and that they are not basing these projections on the most accurate modeling, but there's different models, and that's something that we can all comment on as we look at this plan. It is also worth noting that in terms of sea level rise and projections, that the plan is really designed for the infrastructure that they're recommending to withstand sea level rise. So the sea level rise is about, how tall will it come? And if I put a wall here, when will it overtop the wall? It's not a design to address sea level rise. It's just infrastructure for storm surges to withstand sea level rise. So next slide. So these will go, they kind of go in order from magnitude of really big, expensive infrastructure down to smaller and smaller. That's how these alternatives roll. So I'm not going to read everything here, but I will point out, just to get you acclimated, that the green is the area that is, by the Corps' model, going to benefit from the proposal. The red is the area that is exposed. And the blue lines are the measures. So this one has this giant blue line from Sandy Hook to Breezy Point. This is the massive storm surge barrier. That was one of the proposals that Riverkeeper fought, very tough to get off the table. It has the massive barrier down there at the mouth of the harbor, and then another one at Throg's Neck at the end of Long Island Sound. This plan was unpopular with the public, but also deemed not a good cost-benefit analysis outcome. It was the most expensive plan on the table. Next one, Monica. So that was 2. So this is, they have 2 3s. So because they added one as they went. So there's 3A and 3B. So 3A also has barriers blocking, basically kind of cutting off the whole intersection of New York, New Jersey harbor. The giant outer barrier moves up, and it's now across Verrazano, parallel to the Verrazano Bridge there, south of Manhattan, connecting Staten Island and Brooklyn, and then it still has the Throg's Neck barrier. So you can see still a lot of green, more red around the outside, and very expensive. This one's about $77 billion. So next slide. This is also one that Riverkeeper is opposed to, and that, these barriers would just choke off our waterways, and we fought hard against both of those. This one, 3B, this is actually the one that has been selected at this point. So this does not include the massive barrier at the mouth of the harbor in either location, and therefore we don't need the Throg's Neck barrier, because they're not trying to kind of put New York City in a bathtub with these giant gates, but instead it has multiple gates. It actually has 12 gates spread across smaller tributaries in the region, and you're going to hear from our partners next who work on some of these impacted waterways. And then it has more shoreline-based measures as well, so not as reliant on gates. The gates are smaller and distributed, but the gates still have a very serious detrimental impact to our waterways, and you'll hear more about that as well. So this one is at $52 billion. And it's right in the middle of cost-benefit analysis of all the ones. So next one. Okay, so alternative 4. So again, now fewer barriers, kind of protecting a smaller region. You can see in green the projected part of the landscape that is protected with these barriers. The cost drops again. 43 billion. And this is alternative 4. So this one has not been selected. And then the last one, alternative 5. This one is shoreline-based measures only, no gates, but the shoreline-based measures are just limited to Manhattan and the Port of New Jersey. So very limited, very localized shoreline-based measures, and much more affordable, but not enough of a return on investment in terms of properties protected to meet their property-based cost-benefit analysis. Next slide. Okay, so Riverkeeper is calling for a comprehensive, equitable, future-facing flooding plan. And we do not feel that that's what we're getting yet in this process. What we'd like to see is, we're opposing the storm surge gates. So we would like to see plans that don't rely on blocking off our waterways because they're harmful to aquatic life and river flow dynamics and all of our aquatic ecosystems. And they don't actually protect against sea level rise or heavy rain. So it's a huge downside for our quality of life and destruction of ecosystems. And we're still going to have sea level rise impacts and inland rain events that these barriers aren't going to address. We would like to see the Corps be working on natural and nature-based features first in a phased approach and using those widely. So right now, they're really starting with the big gray infrastructure and then doing some green as they go. But we think that, we should really do the nature-based work first and see how it's going, and then bring in the gray infrastructure incrementally based on that baseline. In terms of water pollution, we think that any of these plans should include reducing water pollution. Right now, the Army Corps' position is that if there are toxins, or there's a Superfund site where any of these infrastructural elements are projected to be installed, that first the local community and or state or EPA, whoever the responsible party, has to complete the cleanup before they'll come in and do that work. So it really leaves communities, largely environmental justice communities where most our water pollution is located, still with those cleanups and potentially left out of any investment if those cleanups are stalled and don't move forward for other reasons. And the gates, the proposal to put in the storm surge barriers, they put permanent structures in the waterway. Even when the gates are open, they're based on kind of bridge-like structures. Some of them actually have in-water, small island type of structures to hold the gates. And the gates themselves will become pollution hotspots because they're going to trap contaminants behind them. The structures will be places where pollution attached to sediment will accumulate, and also a place where our combined sewage overflows could be accumulating, as well as creating back flooding from combined sewer overflows in storm events. For 3B, we do feel good that the geographic scope is protecting more communities. It doesn't include all of the EJ communities, but it includes more than we were expecting based on the property value cost benefit analysis. So we agree that having a bigger footprint and wider geographic distribution of the federal and state investment is really important. But we also think that it's important that we look seriously at retreat, that strategic retreat needs to be included in any plan going forward. We're not going to be able to put walls on all of these communities and waterways and just, stay there forever. We need to really look at retreat seriously, and it should be combined with the creation of more affordable housing, especially for low mobility communities, so they can stay in their communities and not be completely displaced. Next. So the approach that we've learned about, and you'll hear more about this from the Miami Waterkeeper, is to really start with a locally preferred plan. And the idea of calling for a locally preferred plan is that would give us a reset moment, a reset so we don't have to be grandfathered in with old cost benefit analysis and not reap the benefits of all the progressive mandates that have come out of the Biden administration. But we could reset and really start from now what's happening nationally and federally in terms of best practices and best science. So we believe that New York and New Jersey deserve a plan that uses the new cost benefit analysis, and that should be applied to the 5 alternatives, and modifications should be considered based on the new cost benefit analysis. We believe that our plan should follow the new WARDA mandates to address multiple and compound flooding impacts and prioritize natural systems and nature-based infrastructure. We deserve a plan that's driven by an engaged community and is responsive to varying community needs, not just a one size fits all, especially with our low income frontline communities at the table. And we believe that we need a plan that takes the long view. 50 years is buying time, and we don't want to be sacrificing wild, verdant, natural places on which, our lives also rely. Not only our quality of life, but, life itself, especially on these critical estuaries that support our whole eastern seaboard. So to take a short-term approach and really potentially sacrifice these priceless resources is not a path forward that we can support. Then finally, I got one last slide. I'm going to pass it on. So looking forward for us, for Riverkeeper and our partners and the advocacy community, we want everyone to participate in this comment period. We're going to share our action alert if you want to use that as a basis for submitting a comment, or write on your own, whatever works for you. But after this comment period, we need people to continue to stay engaged. Like I said, this is a marathon. We are still at the beginning. We can get a better plan. We see other communities getting better plans, working with the Corps. So we want to urge our non-federal sponsors and partners, New York State, New Jersey, the city, to ask the Army Corps for a locally preferred plan right away, and to step forward and take more of a leadership role in engaging in that plan, and to bring in the stakeholders in this process. The states are well positioned. The Army Corps is asking the NGO community, and of course, we're doing our best with events like tonight and getting the word out, but to really get a cross section of this region of 11 million people, we need the state and city resources to engage in getting the word out and bringing people out. We also want for everyone on this call and all of our advocacy partners to be looking to the other climate resiliency plans. We had Adapt NYC come out of the city in the fall, and we're waiting to see Plan NYC. These plans need to address the elements that aren't going to be addressed by the Army Corps, specifically preserving our remaining coastal ecosystems, wetlands, floodplains, and all those other natural resources that haven't been filled in and built on, to stop building in the remaining floodplains and flood zones, which is still happening extensively throughout our region, and to do that planning for the strategic retreat coupled with safe, affordable housing. So that's going to be a focus for us when we get through this commenting period, and we hope you'll join us in that. So with that, next slide, I say thank you, and I look forward to the questions.
Thanks, Tracy. And if you have questions, write them down, and we'll have time at the end to address as many as we can. And I'm going to keep moving things along. I'm going to ask that Andrea, Willis, and Greg come on camera. We're so happy to have our tributary partners, our partners overall here with us tonight, the New York, New Jersey Urban Tributaries Work Group, with Andrea Parker, who's the executive director of the Gowanus Canal Conservancy, Willis Elkins, the executive director of the Newtown Creek Alliance, and Greg Remeau of Baykeeper, and the chief executive officer of New York, New Jersey Baykeeper. I'm going to let you begin. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you, Riverkeeper, for having us tonight. Great to see everyone in the chat. So we're a working group right now that has really come together because we are all focused on various urban tributaries around the area, and realized that our concerns and comments were starting to align, and that perhaps it would be better if we organize them together. So this is the sort of working list of groups and urban tributaries represented. We're developing a comment letter that I think we're also going to be looking for additional signatories on, and we'll be releasing that fairly soon. And I'm going to give you sort of the rundown of where we are today with where these comments are going. Next slide. So I think first, when we first started speaking as this working group, we realized we really needed to define what an urban tributary was, because the sort of the challenges and opportunities on these urban tributaries are very different than the rest of the 520 miles of coastline in New York City or New Jersey. So an urban tributary is really, it's a tributary is a narrow body of water, but an urban tributary is in a dense urban area. Oftentimes in New York City and New Jersey, they are sites of both ecological and environmental injustice, often because of contamination, combined sewage overflow, and other sort of relics of our industrial past. And then there are also sites of a lot of interesting socio-ecological use, because they're protected, they're smaller, and they're nestled within dense neighborhoods. Next slide. And on these urban tributaries, we have a range of concerns that we're really, looking across these very different sites. We really came down to these 4 shared concerns. Number one, there's an over-reliance in the plan on in-water barriers, particularly on Gowanus, Newtown, Flushing. There's also underplanned sacrifice zones, and a real lack of clarity around why those sacrifice zones were chosen to do that. As Tracy mentioned, there's really we were calling it myopic focus on storm surge, as opposed to the range of other types of flooding that we experience in the low-lying neighborhoods surrounding the urban tributaries. And there's really a misaligned approach to ongoing combined sewage overflow and inland flooding, and sort of the projects and funding that is already in place to help manage those 2 issues. So on the in-water barriers, Tracy alluded a bit to concern about, I think, both the narrowing of tributary mouths. So on several of the tributaries, Newtown and Flushing in particular, the opening will be narrowed from, say, 400 feet in Newtown to about 100 feet. And that's in order to hold up that gate so that it can open and close. We're really concerned about the impact that would have on flow in and out of the tributaries. There is definitely potential and examples of, though the gates are designed to only be closed during storm surge events, we know that they may be closed more often than that, especially as sea level rises. And that the concern there is really is both cutting off the flow, but also sort of promoting this kind of bathtub effect inside. Because of the construction that would be required to build some of these gates, we're really concerned about the construction impacts, both on ongoing water quality, and really specifically on the tributaries that are currently Superfund sites or are otherwise very contaminated. We're concerned about what dredging and construction impacts would have on bringing those contaminants out into our water bodies. Next slide. At the same time, there's other urban tributaries that are sort of left out of the plan altogether. The Bronx River being a main one, and which is an environmental justice community. They really need and could benefit from inland resiliency, and there's no real clear explanation within the plan about why these areas were cut out. Next. And a lot of the overall concern that's really feeding into all of this is this myopic focus on storm surge that that doesn't really pull out the data or the lived experience of the rising groundwater that we feel in our basements, the increased precipitation that we see in events like Hurricane Ida, like the flooding that we see in our neighborhoods. Yes, Hurricane Sandy caused storm surge, but that's one example. We are going to see many, many, many examples of flooding coming from many directions. And we really need a solution that thinks about that combined sense of hydrology. This really doesn't, from our look, seem to be integrated into the plan. Next slide. And kind of along the same lines, you know, the city is maybe slowly, but is investing in longer term investment in combined sewage overflow management and inland flooding management through things like the green infrastructure plan, the long-term control plans. That is an opportunity that needs to be integrated into long-term resiliency in the neighborhoods and not ignored. And essentially the plan for where the barriers are installed is pumping combined sewage and inland flooding out of the barriers into the larger harbor. We think that's a real misuse of funds, and that those funds should be integrated into existing planning to, you know, capture more stormwater in our neighborhoods and increase our sewage pipes overall, so that we can actually manage these flooding events more easily. And I'm going to turn it over to Willis now to talk through our recommendations.
Great. Thanks, Andrea. So second part of our letter is focused on what we do want to see. Obviously, it's, you know, $52 billion. Could do a lot for protecting our communities and improving our connections and you know, environmental quality of our waterways and shoreline communities. So recommendations, a lot of these are very similar to ones that Tracy mentioned from Riverkeeper. So we'll just sort of go through these. First, about natural nature and nature-based solutions. First, making that a priority, and the gray solutions, the walls, the gates, as sort of almost like a last resort to see how the first ones are happening. Incorporating local plans and strategies. Tracy mentioned this as well. A lot of work is already going on the city level, on the community level, on the state level, to even the federal level, right? To deal with this very pressing issue of how to deal with climate emergency in a coastal city. Third, developing comprehensive equity-based solution for all water bodies. Andrea alluded to this, that, you know, some areas were chosen in 3B, some areas were not chosen. And we feel like if the city is going to get a massive investment, it really needs to, there needs to be clear understanding of why certain areas are selected, but we want all areas to be protected with this plan. Environmental justice, Tracy spoke about that as well. We felt like it's largely left out of 3B. And then about the data that's being used to drive this 3B plan. So next slide. So on the first one, you know, we know that using nature based solutions is, you know, can be a very effective way. And there's really great examples from other places around the world in doing this. And there's been efforts obviously in New York City to do more things like, you know, wetland restoration. Obviously it's very tricky when you have very dense urban environment that, you know, there's buildings, the city is still building buildings in many of the neighborhoods that folks like Andrea and myself work in, buildings right next to the edge of the water. And so sometimes it's difficult to make this happen. But, you know, basically these opportunities for addressing, you know, not just storm surge, but, you know, by having nature-based solutions, we can start talking about ways to also combat urban heat island effects, you know, improving air quality, sequestering carbon, you know, building an ecosystem for, obviously all the estuary is incredibly important. Don't need to really iterate that for the Riverkeeper audience. So these are just some examples: living breakwaters, ecologically enhanced bulkheads and revetments, vegetated promenades, elevated promenades that have restored wetland features. And then of course, a sort of multi-layered approach where there's marsh in front of a berm or a living shoreline with a levee. So we really want this to be a main priority for the Army Corps in reevaluating the proposed alternative here. Okay, next slide. Incorporating local plans and strategies. We've been working on putting together a list. It's probably not everything, but There's a lot of planning efforts that have been happening, things like the long-term control plans that the city and the state have been working on to address combined sewer overflow. Obviously, a lot of us in the room have had concerns about those long-term control plans aren't going far enough in preventing sewage overflow and meeting Clean Water Act standards. But nevertheless, those are massive investments, billions of dollars that's going to be spent in New York City in the coming decades. And we need to know, how the Army Corps is going to incorporate with large infrastructure like that. And there's an opportunity to maybe combine that if they're talking about building new rerouting CSO outfalls as part of this plan. There needs to be some strong coordination with DEP and the state on that. Green infrastructure, DEP runs a huge green infrastructure plan in the city. There's obviously a lot more opportunity for expanding that. Moving forward, there's also all of these community efforts. Newtown Creek Alliance, Guardians of Flushing Bay. We worked with Riverkeeper to do vision plans about 5 years ago. There's been a number of other, almost every water body has had community visioning efforts and substantial planning efforts. Gowanus has obviously had massive plans as part of the rezoning. So there's no shortage of local influence and ideas about how to deal with rising sea level, with storm surge, with protecting our communities. Okay, next slide. Right, comprehensive equity-based solution. Again, this is, we're talking about places like the South Bronx. We sort of focus on this a little bit. Bronx River Alliance has helped tremendously with this letter as part of the coalition. And, when you have areas like that that are not just environmental justice neighborhoods, but are serving critical functions. And this is sort of what Andrea talked about too, like these tributaries often have this mix of, community activation, of, recreational use, of natural space, but also of industry and infrastructure. There's a lot of critical operations that are located along our waterways. Obviously, it's why the city grew, but that are still there. And so, things like all of our treatment plants, how are we going to treat sewage if the treatment plants aren't protected from sea level rise and storm surge? And then obviously like the Hunts Point market, it's providing so much food coming through the city. So it's really important that the neighborhoods surrounding these tributaries, that all of them again are protected. Again, thinking about, it's not just the storm surge. Sea level rise is a major issue in this regard as well. We'll go to the next slide. Fully integrating environmental justice. Again, we feel like the plan right now is a little short-sighted in this regard. And Tracy did a great job of sort of mentioning how not adhering to the current standards to incorporating this. It's not just about Justice 40. There's also the Community Leadership Climate Protection Act. It's a major goal of New York State. There's different designations of what is an EJ community the city has, or disadvantaged community that New York State has. And so it's not just about identifying and acknowledging these, but there needs to be, actual, sort of talked about the cost benefit analysis. It's not just to design protection that's just based on property value. And these are neighborhoods, these are people's lives that are at risk. And the people that have the least amount of resources, that have less valuable real estate, need to be fully protected and integrated into this this planning process. So that's our fourth recommendation. Next slide. Yeah, thanks. Lastly is about relevant data. This also came up earlier, but one of the big issues is about sea level rise, and that this plan is based on old data. We're not going to have the new NOAA data until 2025. And so even these, more recent, some of these aren't even that recent, 10 years old since Superstorm Sandy, those occurrences aren't, properly evaluated here. So it's really, troubling that we do have a major issue on our hands. We need massive investment from the federal government, but we need to be doing this in a realistic fashion, and in touch with the reality of what's going to be happening in terms of sea level rise and storm surge predictions. So that's the crux of our recommendations. Essentially, we are opposed to the plan as is. And we really, support an Army Corps alternative that would, better consider local needs and a more broad range approach to, like I said, sea level rise and storm surge. So yeah, that's kind of where we are. Really appreciate Riverkeeper including us. As Andrea mentioned, we'll have our comments finalized soon. And, we really encourage more people to submit their own comments. Hopefully this was helpful. And Greg, also, if there's anything that, I know we sort of rifled through it, that Andrea and I left out, that you want to chime in, please do. It's been a great coalition that we've been building over the past month here, our Tributaries group.
Thanks, Alice. I'll just make a few comments and save the rest for Q&A, and looking forward to Audrey's presentation. There's nothing that you all missed. I just want to reiterate what you said and thank Tracy and Riverkeeper and that whole team who've really been on top of this issue, shared information, done a lot of coordination, technical assistance provided to folks from day one, and working with you, Ellis and Andrea, and the partners at the New York City and New York City, New Jersey Urban Tributaries work group is really been fantastic, and the work that's come out of it is wonderful. There's so much good information that was covered here, so many issues brought to light, but I don't think you can, and this was brought up several times, but I don't think you can highlight it enough. We can stop as many issues as there are, we can stop after one. We're talking about how do we best spend $52 billion to protect communities around the estuary from flooding. Yet, as has been noted, we're only talking about one type of flooding, coastal surge, storm surge from the coast, and leaving out landside flooding, which, as folks know, was part of Sandy, but particularly a huge amount of damage done during Ida. So right from the get-go, when you're talking about investing $52 billion, we'd really want a plan that's comprehensive, that's been fully studied, and that includes all the elements that have that Tracy and Ellis and Andrea have brought forth. $52 billion. There's very few differences. I mean, all the issues in New Jersey are the same as New York. The only differences in the details. But one of the other concerns I want to highlight is, the notion that, well, both that there's not enough information on what happens to communities who are outside the proposed tide gates. For instance, the whole Raritan Bay on both sides, Staten Island side and New Jersey side, is open. What does this mean for them? What does this mean to communities right outside potential tide gates? I prefer not to get bogged down in that, because I do think I agree that we need to go back and get an updated and more comprehensive approach to all these issues. But I just, I don't want it, I don't think we should get lost. This is a once in a lifetime, $52 billion investment. We need to get it right. And it needs to be comprehensive. I'll stop there and look forward to joining folks in the Q&A.
Thank you, Greg. And thank you, Andrea and Willis, for that wonderful presentation. Really helpful. I'm going to keep moving things along. I'll ask you to turn off your cameras. And if Audrey could come on, that would be terrific. So Audrey Siu is the policy director from Miami Waterkeeper, and we're so happy that she could be here with us tonight. Audrey has worked for the Army Corps of Engineers for over 7 years as a regulatory project manager, issuing permits for a wide variety of projects affecting aquatic resources. She spent 3 years as a project management consultant and grant report writer for a local environmental nonprofit. the Dumont Conservancy. Audrey also has over 4 years of private consulting experience with SWC, where she assisted clients by performing contamination research and by leading clients through all phases of environmental permitting, including helping them avoid and minimize impacts to resources in the public trust during the design phase. So welcome, Audrey, and take it away.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. I just want to give first a quick overview of Miami Waterkeeper. We are members of the Waterkeeper Alliance. We are a small organization at 13 members strong, and we're currently focused on issues surrounding Biscayne Bay. So I'll be speaking today about Miami Waterkeeper's work on the Corps' Back Bay study, intended to protect Miami-Dade County from storm surge. And when I say Back Bay, we're referring to Biscayne Bay. So I do want to set up the talk about talking about the challenges associated with Biscayne Bay. Next slide. And Biscayne Bay used to be marvelous. It's our aesthetic and economic jewel. It provides us so much. It's at the center of our community. We gain recreation values, tourism values, ecosystem values. And it may be a little hard to see in the slides, but that bottom left photo is taken in the south portion of the bay. It's a fairly recent photo. And you can see that the water is this beautiful, bright Caribbean blue. I am a Miami native. My parents landed in Miami in the late 60s, and they tell me that Biscayne Bay used to be absolutely gorgeous, but now it's become deeply degraded. Next slide. And we're at a tipping point. We're at a really dangerous time for the bay right now, where it's been so polluted that it can't really absorb any more pollution. And it's undergoing a regime change where our seagrass is dying off. We've had 90% seagrass loss in some places, and it's now being colonized by algae. And what's causing that? It's hardscape, channeling point and non-source pollution into the bay. And the current stormwater system we have is not designed holistically. It's just designed to move water off the land as quickly as possible. In the left photo, if you can see under the bridge, there's a very large sediment plume. And those plumes, that water being shunted into the bay carries with it lots of nutrients, which causes algae blooms. We're having them occur every year now. That never used to happen. And the algae blooms cause these dramatic fish kills. Next slide, please. So what we need for our region is a new paradigm. And Miami Waterkeeper is advocating for nature and nature-based solutions. And I'll just say NNBS for the next portion of the presentation. But is it really new? Nature is the ultimate generator of solutions, but I think we're just appreciating them better. So the definition that Miami Waterkeeper works with is working with nature to address societal problems. And essentially, we need a holistic approach to project design that connects community to the natural environment. Next slide, please. So in South Florida, we have these wonderful ecosystems that provide multiple benefits. We've got mangroves that in their latticework root structure provide nursery for fish and sea life. And they also hold on to shorelines by allowing soil to accrete. Marshes store water and allow for nutrient uptake, which effectively cleanses the water before it's discharged back into the bay. And then we have coral reefs, which is our first line of defense against slowing storm surge. So on the right, you can see a cropera coral, staghorn coral, and it's really lumpy and bumpy. It has a lot of rugosity. So when a wave moves through it, there's a lot of friction, and that slows the wave vortex down. The scientific papers we've been reading suggest that reefs are 97 to 98% effective. A healthy reef is that much effective in slowing wave energy down. Next slide. Of course, in South Florida, we're very concerned about storm surge. We're an average of about 6.5 feet above sea level. And we're especially concerned about hurricane hitting at one of our king high tides. That compounded storm surge is going to be very deadly. So we have orders of magnitude higher seas moving over the land. Next slide, please. So Miami Waterkeeper is advocating for an NBS that provides multiple lines of defense. And what you notice about this schema is that it doesn't keep the water out. It helps us live with the water when it gets here by slowing down storm surge, breaking up the wave vortex. And you can integrate Ray features into it. We're not saying it has to be either or, but these NNBS, we think what they can do is, or I'll put it this way, one engineer I know puts it that mangroves protect seawalls. So we think that we can have less gray infrastructure if we lean heavily into natural features to break up the wave vortex before it gets here. Next slide, please. But how do you quantify these benefits? So the Army Corps must justify via a cost-benefit ratio which projects provide the most bang for the buck. And we get that this is taxpayer money that's subject to scrutiny. But putting a price tag on nature is a recent and developing area of economics. And the Corps doesn't have a good handle on how to do it yet. They're not academics, and they are a reactionary agency. Next slide, please. But here in South Florida, we do have local organizations and some very good research universities who are working on quantifying the benefits of nature. For instance, Earth Economics has looked into wetlands in Southgate, rehydrating Southgate, and found that these rehydrated wetlands could provide $3.3 billion to our economy. And these are the types of things that we need to tell the Corps, and we need to provide them the methodology to do it. Next slide. So our ultimate test in our region for comparing the economic benefits and costs of traditional gray infrastructure to that of NNBFs is our Back Bay study. It's a mere paltry $6 billion as compared to your $52 billion. So the next part of my talk is going to center around our advocacy efforts on getting a locally preferred plan. Next slide, please. This is the waterfront around downtown Biscayne Bay, and you can see how low-lying we are. In 2019, the Army Corps came to town and they started their study and had meetings and took comments. And much of the public feedback asked for green infrastructure and natural solutions. In 2020, the Corps finalized a multi-year feasibility study and identified a tentatively selected plan among 8 alternatives. But what did the $6 billion plan result in? They included some NNBFs in the southern part of the county away from the urban areas. They included some non-structural solutions, such as elevating some critical infrastructure in homes. Next slide, please. But most shockingly, they proposed a very large wall in Biscayne Bay. In some places, this wall is 20 feet high. And there was a lot of anger around this. So we too found that there is a myopic focus on storm surge. This wall would block views, it would stagnate water behind it, it would trap water in, which is especially concerning given our rising groundwater and reason caused by sea level rise. We have this very porous lime rock geology where water moves through it very quickly. The groundwater fluctuates with the rising tide, and more so with the yearly king high tides. And we have a lot of sunny day flooding. So it's very concerning to us. Next slide, please. This is the entrance to the Miami River. Next slide. This is the entrance to the Miami River with the Corps proposed floodgates. Next slide, please. And this last rendering is the before and after of what our community would look like. And what this did is align developers and environmentalists for once. This so rarely happens in our communities, but of course we're concerned about the environmental effects, and the developers were concerned about, blocking multi-billion-dollar views. Next slide, please. So there were three fundamental things that we think really needed to be changed. The first is that the Corps needs to change their cost-benefit analysis, which essentially solves for protecting the most number of property values for the least amount of money. And that is going to skew investments and resiliency to high property value areas, and it exacerbates equity issues. Second, the benefits from the nature and nature-based features are not factored into the formula. And third, nature-based features gain value over time. So whereas gray infrastructure declines and falls apart and will need to be replaced in 50 years, the green infrastructure just starts hitting its stride after 50 years. And of course, sea level rise is not a specific mandate for storm surge. Last, we have to get the Corps to go beyond their comfort zone. They are the executive branch of government. They don't make the laws, they execute on them and they carry them out. And speaking as a former Corps employee, they are very comfortable when they follow the letter of the law. It's the intention of the 1955 study authority that underpins all of this to keep people safe. If that is true, then the narrative to the Corps needs to be that the project means and methods cannot make people less safe or the community worse off. Next slide. So what is it that we wanted? It was a locally preferred plan. The original back-based study, the feasibility study, lasted a couple of years. It started in 2019, and that led up to the tentatively selected plan in 2021. And for those 2 years, Miami Waterkeeper set up a social media campaign, wrote technical letters, and spoke to the mayor's office. The mayor's office, to their credit, cultivated a good relationship with the Assistant Secretary of the Army of Civil Works, Michael Connor. And the mayor's office did send a request for a locally preferred plan in August of 2021. And I want to say, as a community, we were successful because in September of 2021, the Corps agreed and the project was rebooted with the promise specifically to look at a locally preferred alternative that includes NNBFs. Next slide. So where are we now? The process has started again in August of 2022. The Corps has made good on its promises to hold additional charrettes, publicize meetings, and make this information public. This document you see is like a Corps master planning document. And this is a really important document. When you have 100 people in a room at a charrette trying to work towards a specific goal, you need to write the objectives down. And I know it's really hard to see, but in that second column from the right, that bottom paragraph includes specific goal of looking at NNBFs. And the first paragraph under objectives column does name sea level rise. And the Corps in the constraints column is looking at water quality and habitat. So we're very pleased to see that. And at this time, the proposals that have come out of this include a lot more nature and nature-based features. So we're pretty pleased. Next slide, please. but we always have to watch the Corps. So this is the same document that we got from a, I guess, a mole. The Corps had a closed door meeting with other regulatory agencies. And when they showed this document again, you can see that there's, a hole in the objectives column. They took out NNBS as an objective and moved it into the opportunities column. And I'm concerned about that. Miami Waterkeeper is concerned, because if it's being couched as an opportunity, does that mean that it's not something that they must do or must look at this point? Is it just a secondary benefit that they're entertaining? So again, this is a long process. We're just at the beginning. This is the first year out of 5 years, and it's going to be a marathon. And our network of advocates in Miami is looking closely at the Corps process. Next slide, please. So there were 5 critical things that we thought really helped us in this whole process of backing up the mayor's office to get a locally preferred plan. We teamed up with experts outside of our organization. We worked collaboratively with the local sponsor. We had a marketing campaign to help the community better understand the consequences of the Corps' tentatively selected plan. And the rendering of the wall was incredibly important. There's renderings that included in the slides that showed just how bad this was going to be. It helps the community grasp the Corps', I believe it was 412-page feasibility document, which is like this policy Leviathan. It's really difficult to grasp. I'd say the 5th thing that we're very lucky to have in Miami-Dade County is have a mayor who is an environmentalist and who did really listen to our concerns. Next slide, please. And so that is my talk. I'm really grateful for Hudson Riverkeeper for including us, and happy to take questions at the end. Thanks.
Thank you, Audrey. Really appreciate you being here tonight. We're going to continue. I'm going to ask Audrey, if you could, you can turn off your camera and invite Tracy Brown, our president and Hudson Riverkeeper, back. Again, just to wrap up here, pull things together, and we'll share our action for the public. Tracy?
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. Thank you to our partners. It's been really informative and great to have everybody here. So yes, there is an action alert that people can take. You can link to it from riverkeeper.org/barriers and share it, take the action, write your own comments. You can also just kind of take some of our talking points off the landing page and do something on your own as well. Whatever works for you. The main thing is that we engage and stay engaged. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Rebecca and open it up for Q&A. And Chrissy, our host, thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I'd like to bring on Chrissy Remein, who is a colleague of ours. She is the Hudson River Watershed Project Manager. She's been moderating the Q&A chat this evening. Thank you so much, Chrissy. It's now 7:17 and we're beyond our time, but we want to stay and with you. We're going to stop recording now so that you have the freedom to ask the questions you want without being recorded.